a notorious cult leader and musician who had an entire family named after him. He was a mass manipulator and to this very day is considered one of the most notorious cult leaders of all time. Ever heard of Charles Manson? I'm gonna tell you all about him. Born Charles Maddox on November 12, 1934, to 15-year-old Ada Kathleen Maddox. Many assume Manson's biological father appears to have been Colonel Walker Henderson Scott Sr. Colonel worked in a local mills and had a local reputation as being a con artist. When Kathleen told Scott she was pregnant, he informed her that he had been called away on army business. After several months, she realized he had no intention of coming back. Charles grew up not knowing his biological father. In August of 1934, before Charles was born, his mother married a man named William Eugene Manson, a laborer at a day dry cleaning business. Charles' mom often went on drinking sprees with her brother Luther, leaving Charles with multiple babysitters. Kathleen and William divorced only 3 years into their marriage, after William claimed gross neglect of duty by Kathleen. Charles kept William's last name, giving him the infamous name Charles Manson. On August 1st, 1939, Manson's mother and her brother were both arrested for assault and robbery. Both were sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison, respectively. Manson was placed in the care of an aunt and uncle in West Virginia. His mother was paroled out 3 years after being arrested. Manson later stated the first weeks after she returned being the happiest time in his life. Manson and his mother soon moved to Charleston, West Virginia, where Manson continuously remained absent from school and his mother spent her evenings drinking. His mother was again arrested for grand larceny, but was never convicted. The two then moved to Indianapolis, where Kathleen met another alcoholic named Louis Cavender in an AAA meeting, and the two soon got married. Although his mother wasn't the best, Manson had his fair share of problems. When Manson was 9, he set his school on fire. He also got in trouble for truancy and petty theft. In 1947, at the age of 13, he was placed in Guibo School for Boys in Indiana, a school for troubled kids ran by Catholic priests. It was a strict school where punishment for even the smallest infractions included beatings with either a wooden paddle or a leather strap. In 1948, while in Indianapolis, Manson committed his first crime by robbing a grocery store. At first, the robbery was simply to find something to eat. However, Manson found a cigar box containing just over $100, and he took the money. He used the money to rent a room on Indianapolis Skid Row and to buy food. For a time, Manson had a job delivering messages for Western Union in an attempt to live a life free of crime. However, he quickly began to supplement his wages through petty theft. He was eventually caught, and in 1949, a sympathetic judge sent him to a Boys Town, a juvenile facility in Omaha, Nebraska. After 4 days at Boys Town, he and a fellow student, Blakey Nielsen, obtained a gun and stole a car. They used it to commit 2 armed robberies on the way to the home of Nielsen's uncle in Illinois. Nielsen's uncle was a professional thief, and when the boys arrived, he allegedly took them as his apprentice. Manson was arrested 2 weeks later during a nighttime raid. In the investigation that followed, he was linked to his 2 earlier armed robberies. He was sent to the Indiana Boys School, a strict reform school. At the school, other students allegedly raped Manson with the encouragement of a staff member, and he was repeatedly beaten. He ran away from the school 18 times. While at the school, Manson developed a self-defense technique he later called the insane game. When he was physically unable to defend himself, he would screech and wave his arms to convince aggressors that he was insane. He escaped with 2 other boys in February 1951. The 3 were robbing gas stations while attempting to drive to California in stolen cars. They were arrested in Utah and charged federally for driving a stolen car across state lines. Manson was sent to Washington, D.C.'s National Training School for Boys. On arrival, he was given an aptitude test which determined that he was illiterate and had an above average IQ of 109. His caseworker deemed him aggressively antisocial. On a psychiatric's recommendation, Manson was transferred in October 1951 to National Bridge Honor Camp, a minimum security institution. His aunt visited him and told administrators she would let him stay at her house and would help him find work. However, Manson again couldn't help himself and found trouble. 1 month before his parole hearing, Manson was caught raping a boy at knife point. Manson was then transferred to the Federal Reformatory in Petersburg, Virginia. There he committed 8 serious disciplinary offenses, 3 involving homosexual acts. He was then moved to a maximum security reformatory in Ohio, where he was expected to remain until his release on his 21st birthday in November of 1955. Good behavior led to an early release in May 1954 to live with his aunt and uncle in West Virginia. In January 1955, Manson married a hospital waitress named Rosie Jean Willis. Around October, about 3 months after he and his pregnant wife arrived in Los Angeles in a car, he had stolen in Ohio, Manson was charged with the federal crime for taking the vehicle across state lines, something he had already been charged for in the past. As you can clearly see, it's becoming a pattern with Manson where he's constantly in trouble. It seems like he's constantly getting in trouble repeatedly, back to back to back to back to back, and he just keeps getting slaps on the wrist. I mean, I understand he's young, but as you can see, Manson is a troubled teen. After a psychiatric evaluation, he was given 5 years probation. Manson's failure to appear at a Los Angeles hearing on an identical charge filed in Florida resulted in his March 1956 arrest in Indianapolis. His probation was revoked and he was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment at Terminal Island in Los Angeles. While Manson was in prison, Rosie gave birth to their son, Charles Manson Jr. During his first year at Terminal Island, Manson received visits from Rosie and his mother, who were now living together in Los Angeles. In March 1957, when the visits from his wife ceased, his mother informed him Rosie was living with another man. Less than 2 weeks before his scheduled parole hearing, Manson tried to escape by stealing a car. He was given 5 years probation and his parole was denied. You see how women make men do crazy things? Manson received 5 years parole in September 1958, the same year in which Rosie received a mandate for divorce. By November, he was pimping a 16-year-old girl and was receiving additional support from a girl with wealthy parents. By this time, this is when they nicknamed him Big Daddy Manson. I'm just kidding. In November 1959, he pled guilty to a charge of attempting to cash a forged U.S. Treasury check, which he claimed to have stolen from a mailbox. The charge was later dropped. He received a 10-year suspended sentence and probation after a young woman named Leona Ray Stevens, who had an arrest record for prostitution, made a tearful plea before the court that she and Manson were deeply in love and would marry if he was freed. Before the year ended, the women did marry Manson, possibly so she would not be required to testify against them in court. Manson took Leona and another woman to New Mexico for purposes of prostitution, resulting in him being held in question for violating the Mann Act. He was released again. Manson correctly suspected that the investigation had not ended, so he decided to disappear, which again violated his probation, and a bench warrant was issued. An indictment for violation of the Mann Act followed in April 1960. Following the arrest of one of the women for prostitution, Manson was arrested in June in Laredo, Texas, and was returned to Los Angeles. For violating his probation on the check cashing charge, he was ordered to serve his 10-year sentence. Manson spent a whole year trying to appeal the revocation of his probation. In July 1961, he was transferred from Los Angeles County Jail to the United States Penitentiary in Washington. There he took guitar lessons from Barker Karpus gang leader Alvin Creepy Karpus. Among his fellow prisoners during this time was Danny Trejo, who participated in several hypnosis sessions performed by Manson. His mother moved to Washington State to be closer to him during his incarceration, working nearby as a waitress. Although the Mann Act charge had been dropped, the attempt to cash the Treasury check was still a federal offense. Manson's September 1961 annual review noted he had a tremendous drive to call attention to himself, an observation that stayed the same in September 1964. In June 1966, Manson was sent for a second run in Terminal Island in preparation for early release. By the time of his release day on March 21st, 1967, he had spent more than half of his 32 years in either prisons or institutions. This was mainly because he had broken federal laws. Federal sentences were and remain much more severe than state sentences for many of the same offenses. Manson told authorities that prison had become his home, and he requested permission to stay. That is a huge red flag. That is a red flag going all over the place, how he's become so accustomed and used to living in prison and other institutions that he requested to stay upon being granted early release again. As you can see, there's clearly cracks here within the system, how this man keeps getting released back into society with just like slaps on the wrist. But that's the U.S. Less than a month after his 1967 release from prison, Manson moved from Los Angeles to Berkeley, California, which could have been a probation violation. Instead, upon his arrival, he was transferred to the supervision of criminology doctor, researcher, and federal probation officer Roger Smith. Until the spring of 1968, Smith worked at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, which Manson and his family visited frequently. Roger Smith, as well as the founder of Haight, David Smith, received funding from the National Institutions of Health and reportedly the CIA to study the effects of drugs like LSD and methamphetamine on the counterculture movement. The patients at the clinic became subjects of their research, including Manson and his expanding group of mostly female followers. who came to see Roger Smith regularly. Manson received permission from his PO to move from Cali to Haight-Ashbury District in San Francisco. He would take LSD and would use it frequently during his time there. David Smith, who had studied the effects of LSD in rodents, wrote that the change in Manson's personality during this time was the most abrupt he's seen in his entire professional career. Manson then began preaching his own philosophy based on the mixture of Stranger in the Strange Land, the Bible, Dale Carnegie, and the Beatles, which quickly earned him a following. Manson began studying Scientology while incarcerated with the help of fellow inmate Lanier Ranier, and in July 1961, Manson listed his religion as Scientology. A September 1961 prison report argues that Manson appears to have developed a certain amount of insight into his problems through his study of this discipline. Another prison report in August 1966 stated that Manson was no longer an advocate of Scientology. Upon his release in 1967, Manson traveled to Los Angeles, where he reportedly met local Scientologists and attended several parties for movie stars, and completed 150 hours of auditing. Manson's right-hand man, Bruce Davis, worked at the Church of Scientology headquarters in London from November 1968 to April 1969. Following his release from prison on March 22, 1967, Manson moved to California with the help of a prison acquaintance. Living mostly by begging, Manson soon became partners with Mary Brunner, a 23-year-old graduate of University of Wisconsin. Brunner was working as a library assistant at the University of California, and Manson moved in with her. He then met Lynette Fromm, later nicknamed Squeaky, a runaway teen, and convinced her to live with him and Brunner. According to a secondhand account, Manson overcame Brunner's initial resistance to him bringing another woman to live with him. Before long, they were sharing Brunner's residence with 18 other women. Manson targeted individuals for manipulation who were emotionally insecure and social outcasts. Imagine having 18 people live in one home. That is crazy. Manson established himself as a guru in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury District, during which the summer of love was emerging as the new things for hippies. Manson may have borrowed some of his philosophy from the Process Church of the Final Judgment. Its members believed Satan would become reconciled to Jesus and they would come together at the end of the world to judge humanity. Manson soon had his first group of followers, most of them female. Manson taught his followers that they were the reincarnation of the original Christians. Before the end of summer, Manson and some of the women began traveling in an old school bus, putting in colored rugs and pillows in place of many seats that they had removed. Eventually settled in Los Angeles along the coast in 1967. Brunner became pregnant by Manson. On April 15, 1968, she gave birth to their son, named Valentine Michael, in a condemned house where they were living in Topanga Canyon. She was assisted by several of the young women from the family. Brunner, like most members of the group, acquired a number of nicknames, including Mother Mary, Mary Manson, and Linda D. Manson. Manson was an incredible manipulator who attempted to reprogram his followers' minds to submit totally to his will through the use of LSD and unconventional sexual practices that would turn his followers into empty vessels that would accept anything he poured. By the end of his stay in the Haight in April 1968, Manson had attracted 20 or so followers, all under the supervision of his parole officer, Roger Smith. The core members of Manson's following eventually included Charles Watson, a musician and former actor, Bobby Bustillo, a former musician and pornographic actor, Brunner, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten. Manson grew his family through drug use and prostitution without interference from authorities, mainly because of his support from his parole officer, Roger Smith. Manson was arrested on July 31st, 1967 for attempting to prevent the arrest of one of his followers, Ruth Ann Morehouse. Instead of Manson being sent back to prison, the charge was reduced to a misdemeanor and Manson was given 3 additional years of probation, which obviously isn't gonna fucking do anything. I mean, that doesn't matter to him because his PO officer doesn't care. He avoided prosecution again in July 1968 when he and the family were arrested while moving from San Francisco to Los Angeles with the permission of, you guessed it, Roger Smith. When his bus crashed into a ditch, Manson and members of his family, including Brunner and Manson's newborn baby, were found sleeping naked by the police. Afterwards, he was again arrested and released only a few days later, this time on a drug charge. On April 6, 1968, Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys was driving through Malibu when he noticed 2 female hitchhikers, Patricia and Ella, 2 of Manson's followers. He picked them up and dropped them off at their destination. 5 days later, Wilson noticed the same 2 girls hitchhiking again. This time he took them to his home at Sunset Boulevard. He recalled that he told the two girls about his involvement with the Maharishi, and they told him they too had a guru, a guy named Charlie, who recently came out of jail after 12 years. Wilson then went to a recording session. When he returned later that night, he was met in his driveway by Manson. And when Wilson walked into his home, about a dozen people were occupying the premises, most of them young women. By Manson's own account, he had met Wilson on at least one prior occasion at a friend's house in San Francisco, where Manson had gone to get some marijuana. Manson claimed that Wilson invited him to visit his Sunset Boulevard home when Manson came to Los Angeles. Wilson was initially fascinated by Manson and his followers, referring to him as the Wizard. The two became friends, and over the next few months, members of the Manson family, mostly women, became servants and lived in Wilson's residence. This continued for about 6 months. The Manson family developed into a doomsday cult when Manson became fixated on the idea of an apocalyptic race war between America's black population and the larger white population. Manson told some of the Manson family that black people in America would rise up and kill all the white people except for Manson and his family, but they were not intelligent enough to survive on their own. They would need a white man to lead them, and so they would serve Manson as their master. Manson adopted the term Helter Skelter, taken from a song on the Beatles' White Album to refer to his upcoming war. What the fuck is that to say? I mean, you done did it now, Manson. You done did it now, buddy. Violence often follows when someone like Manson views himself as this out-of-earth figure, and violence did follow. Tex Watson became involved in a drug dealing and robbed a 22-year-old named Bernard Crowe. Crowe responded by threatening to kill everyone at Spawn Ranch. In response to this, Manson shot Crowe on July 1st, 1969 at Manson's Hollywood apartment. He turned Spawn Ranch into a defensive camp, establishing night patrols by armed guards. Watson would later write, Blackie was trying to get the chosen ones. Manson brought in members of the Straight Satan's motorcycle club to act as security. This was only the beginning for the Manson family cult murders. 34-year-old Gary Allen Hinman was a music teacher and graduate student at UCLA. At some point in the late 1960s, he unfriended the members of the Manson family, allowing some to occasionally stay at his home. According to family member Susan Atkins, Manson believed Hitman was wealthy. He sent family members Bobby Bussolio, Mary Brenner, and Atkins to Hitman's home on July 25, 1969, to convince him to join the family, turn over all the assets Manson thought Hitman had inherited. The three held Hitman hostage for 2 days, as he denied having any money. During this time, Manson arrived with a sword and slashed his face and ear. After that, Manson instructed Bussolio to stab Hitman to death, so that's what he did. Before leaving, Hitman's blood was used to write Political Piggy and to draw a panther paw, which is a Black Panther symbol. Bussolio was arrested on August 6, 1969, after he was caught driving Hitman's car. Police found the murder weapon in the tire well. On the night of August 8, 1969, Tex Watson took Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Krenwinkel 10050 Cecilo Drive in Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles, California. Watson later claimed that Manson had instructed him to go to the house and totally destroy, and to do it as gruesome as he can. Manson told the women to do whatever Watson said. The occupants in the house were 26-year-old movie actress Sharon Marie Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant, and the wife of film director Roman Polanski, 35-year-old Jay Sebring, 32-year-old Hushek Frykowski, and Frykowski's 25-year-old girlfriend Abigail Ann Folger. And before any of you jump on me about how I'm pronouncing the names, I am not an English major, okay? These fucking names are weirdly spelled, and I'm just trying my best to pronounce them, so please with the comments. Also present on the property were 19-year-old William Garriston, the caretaker, and his friend, 18-year-old Stephen Earl Parent. Music producer Quincy Jones was a friend of Sebring who had planned to join him that evening, but did not go. Watson and the three women arrived at the home just past midnight on August 9th, 1969. Watson climbed a telephone pole near the entrance gate and cut the phone line to the house. The group backed their car to the bottom of the hill that led to the estate and walked back up to the house. They thought that the gate might be electrified or equipped with an alarm, so they climbed the bushy wall to the right of the gate and entered the grounds. Headlights approached them from within the property, and Watson ordered the women to lie in the bushes. He stepped out and ordered the approaching driver to halt. Stephen Parent, who was visiting the caretaker, was driving the vehicle. Watson raised a .22 caliber revolver at Parrott, who begged him not to hurt him, claiming that he would not say anything. Watson lunged at Parrott with a knife, giving him a defensive slash wound on the palm of his hand that severed tendons and tore the boy's watch off his wrist. He then shot him 4 times in the chest and abdomen, killing him in the front seat of the car. Parrott was driving a 1965 AMC Ambassador coupe. Watson ordered the women to help push the car up the driveway. Watson then cut the screen out of a window and told one of the women to keep watch down by the gate. He removed the screen, entered through the window, and let the other 2 women in through the front door. He whispered to Atkins and awoke Frykowski, who was sleeping on the living room couch. Watson then kicked him in the head, and Frykowski asked him who he was and what he was doing there. Watson replied, "I am the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." How fucking scary is that? Can't even imagine. On Watson's direction, the 2 girls found the other 3 occupants in the house and forced them to the living room. Watson began to tie Tate and Sebring together by their necks with the long nylon rope, which he had brought in, then slung it over one of the living room ceiling beams. Sebring protested the murder's rough treatment of the pregnant Tate, so Watson shot him. Folger was taken momentarily back to her bedroom for her purse. She gave the murderers $70. Watson then stabbed Sebring 7 times. Frykowski's hand had been bound with a towel, but he freed himself and began struggling with one of the women as she stabbed at his legs with a knife. He fought his way out the front door and onto the porch, but Watson caught up with him, struck him over the head with the gun multiple times, stabbed him repeatedly, and then shot him twice. The other girl that was outside guarding the driveway heard what she called horrifying sounds and moved towards the house. She told one of the girls that someone was coming to stop the murders. Back inside the home, Folger escaped from the other women and fled out a bedroom door to the pool area. She was chased down on the front lawn, where she was tackled and stabbed. Watson aided in the stabbing. She was stabbed 28 times. She suffered 51 stab wounds in total that night. She also had been struck 13 times in the head with the butt of Watson's gun, which bent the barrel and broke off one side of the gun grip, which was recovered at the scene. In the house, Tate pleaded to be allowed to live long enough to give birth and offer herself an attempt to save the life of her unborn child, but she was stabbed 16 times and then hanged. The coroner's inquest found that Tate was still alive when she was hanged, although the cause of death was determined as a massive hemorrhage. According to Watson, Manson had told the women to leave a sign, something witchy. Atkins wrote "pig" on the front door in Tate's blood. She claims she did this to copycat the murder scene of Gary Hinman, when "political piggy" was written in his blood to get Manson family member Bobby out of jail, who was in custody for that murder. Manson and 6 other members of the family, 4 from the previous night, went for a drive the following night. Manson was apparently displeased with the previous night's murders, so he told Casabine to drive to a house at 3301 Waverly Drive in Los Feliz section of Los Angeles, located next door to a home where Manson and family members had attended a party the previous year. It belonged to 44-year-old supermarket executive Lino La Bianca and his 43-year-old wife, Rosemary La Bianca. Manson disappeared up the driveway, then returned to bring Watson up with him. Manson roused the sleeping Lino from the couch at gunpoint and had Watson bind his hands with a leather thong. Rosemary was brought into the living room from the bedroom, and Watson covered the couple's head with pillowcases, which he bound in place with a lamp cord. Manson left, and Kronwinkel and Van Houten entered the house. Watson had complained to Manson earlier of the lack of quality in the previous night's weapons. Watson sent the women from the kitchen to the bedroom where Rosemary was, and he went to the living room and began stabbing Lino with a chrome-plated dagger. The first thrust went to his throat. Watson heard a scuffle in the bedroom and went there to discover Rosemary keeping the women at bay by swinging the lamp tied to her neck. He stabbed her several times with the dagger, then returned to the living room to resuming attacking Leo, whom he stabbed a total of 12 times. He then carved the word "war" into his abdomen. Watson returned to the bedroom and found Kronwinkel stabbing Rosemary with a knife from the kitchen. Van Houten stabbed her approximately 16 times in the back and exposed buttocks. Watson then cleaned off the dagger and showered while Kronwinkel wrote "rise" and "death to pigs" on the walls and "helter skelter" on the refrigerator door in the victim's blood. She gave Lino 14 puncture wounds with an ivory handle carving fork, which she left jutting out of his stomach. She also planted a steak knife in his throat. Meanwhile, Manson drove the other 3 family members who had departed Spawn with him that evening to the Venus home of actor Saladin Nadir. Manson left them there and drove back to Spawn Ranch, leaving them and the LaBianca's killers to hitchhike home. According to Kasabian, Manson wanted his followers to murder Nadir in his apartment, but Kasabian claims she prevented this murder by deliberately knocking on the wrong apartment door and waking a stranger, and they abandoned the murder plan and left. But unfortunately, they were not done here. 35-year-old Hollywood stuntman Donald Jerome Shea was murdered on August 26, 1969, more than 2 weeks after the Tate and LaBianca murders. When Manson told Shea, Bruce Davis, Tex Watson, and Stephen Grogan to go on a ride with him to a nearby car parts yard on the Spawn Ranch. According to Davis, he sat in the back seat with Grogan, who then hit Shea with a pipe wrench, and Watson stabbed him. They brought Shea down a hill behind the ranch and stabbed and brutally tortured him to death. According to an autopsy report, his body suffered multiple stab and chopping wounds to the chest and blunt force trauma to the head. Y'all, this cult is off the chains. Like, they are just killing people at will with no remorse, and Manson's leading the charge, and whatever the hell he says, it goes. And he ain't playing around. The Tate murders became national news on August 9th, 1969, after the housekeeper arrived for work the following morning. Imagine that. Imagine you come into work the next morning to clean the house and you find a bloody, disturbing murder scene. What the hell? On August 10th, detective of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which had jurisdiction in the Hinman case, informed Los Angeles Police Department detectives assigned to the Tate case of the bloody writing at the Hinman's house. Because detectives believed the Tate murders were a coincidence of a drug transaction, the Tate team initially ignored this and other evidence of similarities between the crimes. During the Tate autopsies, detectives working on the Hinman case noticed similarities in the weapons used, the stab wounds, and the writing in blood on the walls. They brought the information to detectives working on the Tate murders. According to Detective Charlie Gunther, Vince Bugalosi, Vince didn't want anything to do with the Hinman case. Hinman was a nothing case to him, and he didn't want to prosecute it. Held briefly as a Tate suspect, Garrison told police he had neither seen nor heard anything on the murder night. He was released on August 11th, 1969, after undergoing a polygraph examination that indicated that he had not been involved in the crimes. The LaBianca crime scene was discovered at 10:30 p.m. on August 10th, approximately 19 hours after the murders were committed, when 15-year-old Frank Schuther's, Rosemary's son from a prior marriage, and Leno's stepson returned from a camping trip. On August 12, 1969, the LAPD told the press it had ruled out any connection between the Tate and LaBianca homicides. On August 16th, the sheriff's office raided Spawn Ranch and arrested Manson and 25 others as suspects in a major auto theft ring that had been stealing Volkswagen Beetles and converting them into dune buggies. Weapons were seized, but because the search warrant had been misdated, the group was released a few days later. What the fuck? In a report at the end of August, the LaBianca detectives noted a possible connection between the bloody writings at the LaBianca's house and the singing group The Beatles' most recent album. Still working separately from the Tate team, the LaBianca's team checked with the sheriff's office in mid-October about possible similar crimes. They learned of the Hinman case and also learned that the Hinman detectives had spoken with Bussolino's girlfriend, Katie Lutzinger. She had been arrested a few days earlier with the members of the Manson family. Following up leads a month after they had spoken with Lutzinger, LaBianca's detectives contacted members of a motorcycle gang, the same gang Manson tried to recruit as bodyguards while the family was at the Spawn Ranch. Meanwhile, a dormitory mate of Susan Atkins informed LAPD of the family's involvement in the crimes. Atkins was booked for the Hinman murder, and she told sheriff's detectives that she had been involved in it. Then transferred to Sybil Brand Institute, a detention center in Monterey Park, California. She began talking to bunkmates Ronnie Howard and Virginia Graham, to which she gave details about the events in which she had been involved with. On December 1st, 1969, the LAPD announced warrants for Watson, Krenwinkel, and Kasabian in the Tate case. The suspects involved in the LaBianca murders were noted. Manson and Atkins, who already were in custody, were not mentioned. Watson and Krenwinkel were already under arrest with authorities in McKinney, Texas, and Mobile, Alabama, having picked them up on notice from LAPD. Informed that a warrant was out for their arrest, Cassabian voluntarily surrendered to authorities in Concord, New Hampshire on December 2nd. On September 1st, 1969, the distinctive .22 caliber high-standard buntline special revolver Watson used on Parent, Sebring, and Frykowski have been found and given to police by a 10-year-old who lived near the Tate residence. The knives discarded en route from the Tate residence were never recovered, despite a search for it. A knife, however, was found behind the cushion of a chair in the Tate living room, apparently that of Susan Atkins, who had lost her knife in the course of the attack. The trial began on June 15, 1970. The prosecution's main witness was Cassabian, who, along with Manson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel, had been charged with 7 counts of murder and 1 count of conspiracy. Since Cassabian, by all accounts, had not participated in the killings, she was granted immunity in exchange for testimony that detailed the nights of the crimes. Originally, a deal had been made with Atkins in which the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty against her in exchange for her grand jury testimony, on which the indictments were secured. Once Atkins refused that testimony, the deal was withdrawn. Because Van Houten had participated only in the La Bianca killings, she was charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 of conspiracy. Originally, Judge William Keene, who had reluctantly granted Manson permission to act as his own attorney because of Manson's conduct, including violations of a gag order and submissions of outlandish and nonsensical pre-trial motions, the permission was withdrawn before the trial started. Manson filed an affidavit of prejudice against Keene, who was replaced by Judge Charles Older. On Friday, July 24th, the first day of testimony began. Manson appeared at court with an X carved into his forehead. He issued a statement that he was considered inadequate and incompetent to speak or defend himself, and that he had X'd himself from the world. Over the following weekend, the female defendants duplicated the mark on their own foreheads, as did most family members within another day or so. The prosecution argued the triggering of Helter Skelter was Manson's main motive. Family members littered near the entrances and corridors of the courthouse. To keep them out of the courtroom, the prosecution subpoenaed them as witnesses who would not be able to enter while others were testifying. But in the end, justice will prevail, and it did. On January 25th, 1971, the jury returned guilty verdicts against the 4 defendants on each of the 27 separate counts against them. Midway through the penalty phase, Manson shaved his head and trimmed his beard. He told the press, "I am the devil, and the devil always has a bald head." The effort to free Manson via the copycat scenario failed. On March 29th, 1971, the jury returned verdicts of death against all 4 defendants on all accounts, and on April 19th, 1971, Judge Older sentenced the 4 to death. Manson was admitted to state prison from Los Angeles County on April 22nd, 1971 for 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. As the death penalty was ruled unconstitutional in 1972, Manson was resentenced to life with the possibility of parole. What the hell? Why the hell was he given life with the possibility of parole? Like, he was just on death row, and you give him a sentence with possibility of parole? That's crazy. What the hell? It's ridiculous. Following the 1972 decision of California versus Anderson, California's death sentences were ruled unconstitutional, and that any prisoner now under a sentence of death may file a petition of habeas corpus. Manson was thus eligible to apply for parole after 7 years incarceration. His first parole hearing took place on November 16, 1978 at California Medical Facility, where his petition was rejected. As it fucking should. As it should be. Are you kidding me? On April 11th, 2012, Manson was denied release at his 12th parole hearing, which he did not attend. After his March 27th, 1997 parole hearing, Manson refused to attend any of his later hearings. The panel at the hearing noted that Manson had a history of controlling behavior and mental health issues, including schizophrenia and paranoid delusion disorder, and was too great a danger to be released. The panel also noted that Manson had received 108 rules violation reports, had no indication of remorse, no insight into the causative factors of the crimes, lacked understanding of the magnitude of the crimes, and had an exceptional callous disregard for human suffering, and had no parole plans. At the April 11, 2012 parole hearing, it was determined that Manson would not be reconsidered for parole for another 15 years. Manson would have been eligible for parole in 2027, where he would have been 92 years old. Manson died from cardiac arrest resulting from respiratory failure brought on by colon cancer at the hospital on November 19th, 2017. Woo! Talk about a case. That was crazy. That was crazy. That was definitely one for the books. Charles Manson. Holy shit. This guy is off the chains, man. Like, seriously, this guy's off the chains. That man is wild. And it really showed the cracks that we have in the criminal justice system here in the United States, because clearly he was a troubled teen who got in trouble with the law frequently, often, repeatedly, and he was constantly released back into society. I mean, he had a pretty fucked up childhood too, with his mom being an alcoholic and neglectful, but holy shit. Whew. But that is going to do it for this video. I hope you guys did enjoy this one. Any suggestions, just leave them down in the comments below and I will make that video possible for you. Make sure you subscribe, like, and comment to the YouTube channel. All my social media will be linked down in the description below. My Snapchat, my Instagram, and my Twitter. So make sure you follow my social medias down below. And I will catch all of you guys in the next one. Peace.